A while ago, I put out a poll for you guys to pick a game for me to review, which ended in a 3-way tie. One of those games in that tie was Alan Wake Remastered. I knew next to nothing about this game. I knew it was a cult classic, I knew it was by Remedy, who's infamous for making mind-bending games, and I vaguely knew the idea of the plot. I honestly was kind of dreading playing it. I thought it would be alright, and that I was going to end up grinding through a mediocre game out of obligation. It's safe to say that I had no idea what I was in for, and just how much I was going to adore this game. The original did come out in 2010, so I think the waters have calmed and it might be safe to talk about spoilers, so just know going forward that this will be a spoiler review. And I will be also talking about the DLC missions titled The Signal and The Rider, which are included in the remastered edition of the game. So let's dive into this review of a game that has a lake-sized amount of lore. Or like a cauldron of good writing. Because it's called Cauldron Lake. I want to get this section out of the way because there really isn't much to talk about, so let's get into the negatives. I think the gameplay, while fun enough to warrant an 11-hour campaign, isn't fleshed out much, but again, it doesn't really need to be. I'll get into the gameplay later. It's kind of obnoxious that the camera never stays on one shoulder as it changes with the camera, and there's no shoulder swap button. Because it came out in 2010, the graphics aren't the greatest, and the acting a lot of the time isn't the best I've seen. It's not nearly as bad, but the acting did remind me of the infamous scene from Heavy Rain. I think the reason why is because the voice acting is done separately from the motion capture, which at the time was still rusty, so the way they say things seems silly and uncoordinated to the model's movement. The spotty acting is much more apparent at the beginning and becomes less so as you move on. But it really made me think for a while that Alan Wake was going to be another Heavy Rain, Beyond Two Souls, and Life is Strange. Except that Alan Wake, isn't shit. The acting is also only iffy in the cutscenes, but the majority of important things happen in playable real time, and cutscenes are mainly reserved for the real important stuff. Hey, what about the cutscene where he just sits in a room for at least 12 hours? Given the plot, it does make sense for you to do so, but if you want to go in spoiler-free, do not read the manuscript pages. I understand that you're playing through the story that you're currently writing, but it was upsetting that I was expecting the bulldozer attack because I read a manuscript page that said that was going to happen in the same mission. I feel like it even would have been fine if they just jumbled up the missions that the pages appear in. Like, if I read the bulldozer page in the first mission, then I would still be surprised when I saw it, and would also be like, oh shit, I remember that. I'm not a fan of the light platforming that shows up more often in the Rider DLC, and I think the fact that this is a Remedy game can hurt it a bit, in the sense that it's not the most accessible. Like, I'm already confused the whole time, and I am kind of an idiot. I really wouldn't appreciate this game as much as I do if the internet didn't exist, because I needed to read a recap just so I could understand what I saw. Like, I was super confused about Mr. Scratch, who ended up being his replacement, and an explanation for where Alan was in the real world. And I thought Alan wrote that he died in Alice's place, and not just took her spot in the dark place. I also didn't fully understand why Rose was tweaking when you go see her in her trailer, how they were on that island even though it got destroyed in the 70s, or why Dr. Hartman was lying to Alan in his clinic. But I now understand that it's so that he could control Alan and the power of his writing. And that's a good place to start the next segment, because those are all of my complaints, and I really want to talk about what this game is about. Like I said in the intro, I only had a vague idea of the game's plot. It was summarized to me as an author living through his horror novel, and he has to keep going and keep writing to escape. Now, when I heard that, I assumed that in this game's reality, Alan Wake was safe writing his book, and that he essentially just wrote himself in as the main character, that the danger was all in his head, and that this whole game was some heady, douchey, and pretentious metaphor for what it's like to be a writer. And while it is true that Alan Wake's reason for vacationing in Bright Falls mirrors Remedy's moving from Max Payne to something new, according to Sam Lake, I couldn't have been more wrong. Not only did I have a very surface-level understanding of the story, and incorrect assumptions based on that, but Alan Wake is one of the most intelligently written stories I've ever seen, crafted by some of the most down-to-earth and sweetest people you will ever meet. This game draws a lot of inspiration from classic pieces of pop culture like The Shining, and the plot's clearest inspiration, for me at least, was Stephen King's It. Bright Falls is a pretty small town corrupted by a supernatural darkness similar to Derry, Maine. The difference being that the Dark Presence, as they call it, corrupts and uses creative people's works of art as a source of power, bringing them to life. As Alan's writings echo the work of the old gods of Asgard and Thomas Zane, I absolutely adore this premise, as it doesn't put Alan in his horror novel, but it takes the horror novel to him, in his reality. And since the Dark Presence derives power from Alan's manuscript, it still needs him for the time being to continue to write and make it more powerful, possibly taking over Alan himself. At the same time, the Dark Presence's power is also its downfall, as Alan replaces Alice in the Dark Place through his writings, which is a big sacrifice, but it stops the Presence from further taking over Bright Falls and could also be the key to Alan's escape via his next book, Return, teased at the end of the Rider DLC. Yes, the Dark Presence is possibly the biggest threat to his sanity, his safety, and the safety of those he loves and wants to protect, but with that typewriter, he still holds its leash. Now, I don't really like to do in-depth story or lore analysis in my review, but I can't help but gush over how well crafted and satisfyingly tied together it all is. Remedy loves to make confusing games, and Alan Wake is no exception. But at the same time, it all makes sense. One of the few problems I could see someone having with the story is very similar to Eddie's inhaler from It, where it only works because they believe it does. In my opinion, I don't really think it's as lame as that, but some might. In the story, they bring up a few times that a light switch called the clicker was given to Alan from his mom to help him sleep through the night when he was a kid. It really is just a switch, it's not even connected to anything. But it does have the power to stop the Dark Presence. It's not just because he believes it can, though. It's because Thomas Zane, or Alan through Thomas Zane, I'm not really sure, wrote in the manuscript that it can do that. It literally can defeat the Dark Presence because it has the narrative power to do so. In reality, it shouldn't work, just like Eddie's inhaler shouldn't work. But the difference is that Alan or Thomas have the ability through the darkness to change reality and put a crack in that armor. One of my favorite parts about Alan Wake is how they leave you with just enough to be satisfied while also craving more. A good example of this being Thomas Zane. I thought it was genius to have Alan be a new victim to be thrust into this pre-existing conflict between Tom and the Dark Presence, especially as it takes the form of Tom's old flame, Barbara Jagger, to fool him, as he's desperate to get his partner back. However, I still don't know if Thomas is even alive, or how he's helping us, or how he got the manuscript pages. I don't understand who Mr. Scratch is, or how he will affect Alan's life going forward, and I'm so excited to find out. Honestly, I'm sure Remedy was going to make a sequel no matter what, but given the fact that it was only a cult classic and barely got any spotlight until 2023, thank goodness we got a follow-up. And I 100% mean that, because I can barely wait to play the next game, and it's already out. I have no idea how Day One fans waited 13 years for a follow-up to a game so beautifully written and so confusing. I've been asking myself where this game has been all my life, and wish I had played it sooner. But at the same time, those cryptic words of "it's not a lake, it's an ocean" have been echoing in my head for weeks. Even if I had played it a year sooner, I would have been on the floor tweaking like Alan in the DLC, trying to figure out what it means and if Alice telling him to wake up means anything. The characters in Alan Wake are very likable, but a little flat. There's nothing really wrong with them, and they're not poorly written, but that doesn't mean they're written super well. Like, Alan is likable in this game, and I think he is mainly won over by his goals. Not only are we rooting for this guy to survive because, empathy, but it's a very noble goal, as his survival is secondary to his need to save his wife. It is a little easy to not like him in the beginning during this conversation, but, like, I can see how that wouldn't be the biggest deal in the world. Couples fight, he's been high-strung because he's had writer's block for 2 years. He's been having nightmares that would eventually become true and awaken his deepest fears and put his wife's life on the line, and he snapped. That exact same thing happens to everyone like 4 times a month. We've all been there. If she can forgive him, then I can too. And I really love Nightingale. Not on a deep level or anything, but he's just a goofy guy. I love how he has brief deja vu when dealing with Alan and Barry in the jail, even if it doesn't amount to much. And him constantly calling Alan different author names is hilarious.
Get him up, Hemingway! Stay right where you are, Spillane! Nowhere to run now, Dan Brown!
I've got you now, Raymond Chandler.
Get back in the cell, Stephen King!
I love how Cynthia's written and how much she cares to help others. She's been fending off the Dark Presence since the 70s and wants to help anyone else who's fighting it by setting up caches around town. It also makes tons of sense how she's so paranoid of the dark that she started living at the power plant, how she set up the well-lit room, and how she's so neurotic that she's keeping an account for every single bulb in the well-lit room. But far and away, my favorite character in this game is Barry. When he first called Alan, I thought he was funny because he sounded like Lightning McQueen's agent. And then when he showed up in Bright Falls, I thought, oh, this guy's dead for sure. But then as we spent more and more time with him, he grew on me a lot, and so did that dread. I wasn't really worried for Alan too much because there's a whole ass second game that came out 13 fucking years later, but I could have sworn that Barry was gonna die. And every bird attack and helicopter crash just made that feeling worse. He never failed to make me laugh, whether it was him rifling through the different keys while I was fighting for my life, or when he shows up wearing a headlamp and a bandolier of Christmas lights. You have no clue how relieved I was when the end of the penultimate episode rolled around, and Barry decided to stay in the well-lit room, the safest place possible in this game. 2 characters I really am glad were in the game were Odin and Tor, 2 retired rockstar geezers. Not only are they pretty fun dudes who help Alan and Barry through their music, which was at some point corrupted by the Dark Presence, but they provide one of the best set pieces in the game, which is saying a lot, as Alan Wake has plenty of great ones. Fighting the Taken on that Old Gods of Asgard stage with the music playing, fireworks blasting, and caches of ammunition was one of the most badass scenes I've ever gotten to play in a video game. Granted, I did play it on easy, but after hours of tense encounters with these shadowy enemies that always made me feel like I barely scraped by, no matter how much health I had left, it was so exhilarating to take down even the toughest of enemies with practically no sense of any real danger. I also really like the set pieces where you were mainly only fighting to buy yourself time to escape. Like the mental hospital courtyard sequence, but especially the helicopter sequence, where you fight off Taken while Sheriff Breaker gets the chopper ready. That one was really interesting as you had more options available, and it was much less claustrophobic. But the interesting set pieces continue in the DLC, and are more consistently memorable than the ones in the base game. Like when you take down the Possessed Deerfest float, the giant hamster wheel maze you run through on your way to the lighthouse, and the run to the lighthouse itself. I could see how letting the lighthouse take out your enemies in the final stretch would be lame and uninteresting on paper, but I think the fact that it's more relieving and feels more like a saving grace shows just how good Alan Wake is at being a survival horror. And it's a fucking lighthouse. It's like getting the BFG in Doom Eternal. In fact, Alan Wake is so good at being a survival horror that it's probably my favorite I've ever played. And I've gone through Resident Evil 2, 3, 4, 7, and 8 more times than I can count. And that is very opinionated. I'm not saying that Alan Wake is definitively better than those games. I just like this game's gameplay loop more. Over the course of this channel, we've established that I'm not exactly the sharpest light bulb in the light bulb drawer. So it shouldn't be a surprise that I don't really miss the puzzles that I've gotten used to in the Resident Evil series. Not that I don't like them, but each game with puzzles in it always just has one that I always get confused by and spend way too much time on than I should. But that isn't a problem I have in Alan Wake. I really like how simple the gameplay is, but that's not to say it's uninteresting. I love how the shadowy enemies are simply that, shadows. So bullets don't hurt them until you expose them to the light. I think it was a really smart idea to not make every enemy only be affected by charged light, as it still keeps the strategy of battery management without hinging the gameplay on it too much. And in Resident Evil games, I'm always worried about bringing the wrong gun and never getting any ammo for it, but there's only 1 or 2 versions of each gun in this game, and there's always plenty of ammo and batteries. I especially like having to juggle slowly advancing enemies and charging poltergeist objects. It's a neat addition to the story as well, as the Dark Presence is getting more and more desperate to stop you, that it stops only corrupting people and just starts hucking barrels and trees at you. The car combat isn't anything special, but running over enemies is always satisfying. And I really like the Demolition Derby in the DLC. The only complaints I have regarding the gameplay are the shoddy camera, like I mentioned, and I really don't like when you only have a flashlight or flares and don't have a weapon. The dodging and mobility in this game aren't the greatest, so having no offense and practically no defense either can be really obnoxious when you don't have many great escape options. But I think there are only 2 encounters like that in the game, and I know the first is mainly to teach you how useful flares can be for saving your skin and buying you time when you're cornered or have low health. One of the best and most noticeable parts of Alan Wake is its atmosphere. Remedy knows how to make a game spooky. I always felt at the edge of my seat like someone was just behind me. I always thought I was hearing other people's footsteps softly in the not-so-distant trees surrounding me, or that I was hearing whispers in the woods. This is a bit ironic considering what the Taken are, but I was always literally jumping at shadows, which was especially true during the fights with the practically invisible enemies that dash around you when you finally manage to shine a light on them. And there was that one time I, literally jumped at my own shadow, but we don't gotta talk about that. It's super interesting how this game is based around that childhood fear of the dark, and it makes every street lamp you run into a beacon of sanctuary and relief. I think the best way to show you how good this game's atmosphere is to show you a section of the first episode right after the car crash. You're forced to walk through the woods to find the nearest gas station so you can call the sheriff for help, and as you fight your way past the Taken, you see the gas station past the trees in the distance. Its neon lights are a welcome sight, as getting there is my main goal, and I've made it far enough to see it, but it's almost haunting as it seems so close, but there's still so much you have to live through to get there. As I was wrapping up Alan Wake Remastered, I thought it was only alright. I remember thinking that it was fitting that a game inspired by the works of Stephen King would fall into the same trope his books do. Be really great 90% of the time, and then stumble at the finish line and have a bad ending. I thought that Alan Wake was a pretty open and shut story that they tacked a sequel onto years later. But when I finished the game and credits hit, I realized that this was only the beginning, and there was so much more story to tell. I fucking love this game. I'm a bit torn between a 9 and a 9.5, but I think I'm gonna give it a 9 out of 10. I can easily say that it is now one of my new favorite games of all time, definitely in my top 10, and I cannot wait to play the sequel. Except, this script was written weeks ago, and I already played the sequel because I fucking suck at keeping a schedule.